Well, those of us in Manitoba this week were mostly out of the fray that went along with the solar eclipse. We were only scheduled to have a partial view, and then the cloud further obstructed our vision. Not like back in 1979, when Manitoba was one of the best places to view the solar eclipse. Some of you may have memories and stories about that. However, if you live in Texas, this week it was a much bigger deal. A total solar eclipse in Texas is so rare that the last one was in, yes, 1397. And the next one will not be visible until February of, yes, 2343. So people with actual experience of a total solar eclipse would have been hard to find. So as you can imagine, the rumors and the panic were evident. It's going to crash the electrical grid, cell phones are going to fail, stock up on your groceries, the hospitals are going to be overrun, the end of the world is coming. And then it happened. Not the end of the world, of course, but in North Texas, the clouds parted just in time for the totality, and crowds of people looked and cheered and shouted and were amazed by what they saw. And it was pretty short-lived. It's an event that lasts only a few minutes. And while it brought groups of people together in awe and amazement, lots and lots of other people missed it. And I've been wondering about those people who didn't get to see it, only heard about it. When someone said to them, "I saw it," was it easy for them to believe that? They have the advantage, of course, of the media lead up to the event, the scientific explanations, the exact predictions, and the stream video recordings. Although we also know it's getting easier and easier to fabricate videos these days. Still, the fact of the eclipse was pretty common knowledge. So what would be harder to believe, what would be harder wouldn't be so much the fact of it, but rather the experience. The part that's hard to explain, the part that made the people cheer, the part that brought them together, the part that inspired them, that made them say, "Wow." It might be the inspiration that's hard to believe if you didn't get to be a part of it, if the clouds were in your way. And if you imagine back to the last total solar eclipse in Texas back in 1397, what do you think the people thought when the sky went dark and the sun disappeared? Did they believe their eyes? Were they afraid? Were they filled with awe? Or both? How did they wrap their brains around it? Or did they think maybe they imagined it? And if they missed it, did they believe any of the stories when they emerged from the cave or the trees or the nap that had kept them from seeing it? Or what of those who we assume were there to see the phenomenon in the sky, who recorded it in petroglyphs in Ireland, for example, dating back to 3,340 BCE? That's more than 5,000 years ago. Can you imagine? Well, I bring this up, of course, because I think it might help us get into the minds of Jesus' followers. There are some echoes of those very wonderings in today's Bible reading. We don't always notice it in this way, but all the Easter stories in the Bible are some combination of people having a Jesus resurrection experience and some people missing it, and disbelieving it and wondering about it. And mostly we notice this theme when we talk about the disciple Thomas, who's known for saying he wants to see it before he believes it. But Thomas is not alone. And today there's no mention of Thomas at all. Jesus appears to a group of followers who are startled and terrified and thought they were seeing a ghost. And we're led to believe that Jesus isn't really surprised by that reaction. He begins by saying, "Peace be with you." And then quickly he invites them to look at him and touch him. And my favorite phrase in the story is what comes next, when it says, while in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. He said to them, "I don't suppose you have some food around?" There are a couple of things in particular that I notice about that phrase. The first is perhaps that no matter the circumstance, the call is for Christians to notice the needs around them, that there are hungry people in body and spirit, and our job is to share our food. You could also argue that the stories about seeing and touching and eating with Jesus were about proving the miraculous power of God, that this thing was like really, really, really real. But I don't think so. Yes, it points to the astonishing nature of the story, and therefore the astonishing nature of God, for sure. But I don't think it's really about proving it or convincing, precisely because the stories also contain within them so much doubting and so much wondering. Luke's story today doesn't resolve any speculation at all, even with all the seeing and the touching and the eating. Not like Thomas, who once he sees, he's filled with faith. No. What was the phrase? While in their joy, they were disbelieving and still wondering. I think back to an event I attended pre-COVID. That's how we measure so many things now, right? With Dr. Andrew Root from Luther Seminary in Minneapolis. And he talked about how fragile and how contested all belief is in this world. Witness all the panic about the eclipse. And faith, in particular, is increasingly greeted with suspicion in this part of the world, isn't it? There are plenty of ways to define a flourishing, meaningful life these days. Many of these were tested and refined and redefined through the pandemic, weren't they? But meaning can certainly be found in friendship, through sports teams, in yoga, celebrity, family, vacations, social justice work. Even money and purchasing can provide a sense of fulfillment to some, well, until it doesn't. But we live in what Charles Taylor calls a disenchanted and secular age, where all belief is contested. You can't believe anything you see or read or are told. We're suspicious of expertise, and with the developments of artificial intelligence, it's becoming increasingly difficult to figure out what is true. So even those among us with the strongest faith may well wonder whether we've got it all wrong, and why we bother to gather in a place like this on Sunday mornings. Of course, we also live in a time when all belief is contested, even non-belief. So even those who are convinced that God can't be real find themselves looking up at a mountain or holding a new baby or up at the sky in the middle of the day when the moon passes by the sun, and they cannot help but doubt their certainty. Maybe there is something more, something bigger to this life after all. In his books, Dr. Root describes interviewing people about whether they have ever felt like they've had an experience of something they might call God. And people would say, yes, but they hadn't told anyone about it. Not even people at their church. Or if he asked if they could ever describe a time when God was using them, they would share a story that they hadn't told anyone else ever. You don't talk about these things because, well, how do you explain them in the natural, material, rational world in which we live without kind of feeling superstitious or naive? Ask the people who experienced a resurrected Jesus, who in their joy were still wondering and disbelieving. You know, despite the vast differences in technology and culture, and well, pretty much everything about daily life, we were then, and we are now, surrounded by a great deal of uncertainty and mystery. And that is where faith has room to live and grow. Not in artificial uncertainty, but rather in the very places where we wonder. Where we are open to being astonished. And that, I think, is the key to being Easter people. Not that we must be convinced, but that we are open to being amazed. That we might set aside some of the cynicism that surrounds us so that we are open to awe and being inspired. And that in our hesitation and in our waiting and in our doubt, there are still things for us to do. God says, be witnesses. Open your eyes to the wonder. Notice even partial eclipses. Oh, and be sure to provide snacks. Amen.